Then I began to look at the history of education to get a sense of how we got to where we are today. And it pretty commonly came up that the public education system was born in the early industrial days and was a system to serve the ends of the society at that time. As Gatto says, mass schooling of a compulsory nature really got its teeth into the United States between 1905 and 1915, though it was conceived of much earlier and pushed for throughout most of the 19th century. The reason given for this enormous upheaval of family life and cultural traditions was roughly threefold. 1, to make good people, 2, to make good citizens, and 3, to make each person his or her personal best. Although these do not seem like terrible goals, we have not achieved them because the means to these ends has not changed since the beginning of this system. To make each person his or her best manifests in a way that seems a lot more like to make each person the best he or she can be for our society. This instills conformity to what will make the student most in sync with what the society demands, and since the school system was aiming to make people who fit society's mold 100 years ago, students are very clearly not ready for today's world. One antiquated function that remains is to sort people into their anticipated social roles and train to fit what society deems most appropriate. People are pushed through the system and categorized into 2 main groups: non-academic workers and academic-minded thinkers. This sorting removes the chance for non-traditionally academic people to explore other areas in which they may thrive, and limits traditionally academic people to the roles those types have filled for the last century. This could hardly be called helping students achieve his or her best. As our society has changed and the kinds of people we hope will exit the schooling system changes, we have not adequately changed the system. Students are still sorted by age and ability and taught the same subjects as they were in past years, with some variations. Ken Robinson says, "The fact is that given the challenges we face, education doesn't need to be reformed. It needs to be transformed. The key to this transformation is not to standardize education, but to personalize it. To build achievement on discovering the individual talents of each child, instead of piling reform on top of reform, instead of tinkering toward utopia, which is the title of the book about education reform over the last century, we need to build from the bottom up. The new struggles we need to face must be taken into account when designing a system of education. Change must take place with the ends of education in mind, and we will not adjust properly by simply changing the means by which we educate our youth. Until we can identify a communal narrative and redefine the purpose of schooling, we will not effectively redesign schooling." Sir Ken Robinson eloquently describes the issue of our failing system in his TED Talk, Changing Educational Paradigm. He presents the problem by reminding the listener of the 2 main reasons for educational reform. The first is that we need to find a way to prepare students to take their places in an unpredictable economy. The second is that while going through the process of globalization, we still want people to retain a sense of cultural identity. The main problem is one I have touched on and one that comes up in the writings of Gatto, Ravitch, Robinson, and others on the subject of education. This is the need for change. All these people and many more recognize that we are long due for a much bigger change in the system. One might look and see myriad reforms, but we continue to fail because we are trying to fit these reforms into the system by doing what has been done in the past. Sir Ken describes the futility of this with the following example. My parents' generation went through the education system understanding that the following was a fairly reliable life plan. Work hard in school, get good grades, get into a good college, earn a degree, and get a high-paying job. We have reached a point where this formula no longer holds true. And as students recognize this, they become increasingly less willing to buy into a system that has the potential to fail them. This is particularly true since the failing system also has the immense potential to marginalize what students are genuinely interested in and lessen their ability to interact with passion and be engaged with their educational experiences. To ask students to give up so much time and effort and not receive what was promised in return for that effort is tragic. To have teachers locked into a system as much as students are and not have the impact that they were drawn to this profession to have is absurd. And to ask community members to pay taxes to fund a system that is failing the students who are, in essence, the future of their communities is not tolerable. This is a big problem. We are wasting a great deal of time and money by pouring it into this failing system. It is futile not to change. This wastefulness breeds a sense of cynicism in teachers and particularly students as they see that their time is being wasted. To understand the necessary change, we must better understand how we are failing. Robinson goes on to describe the following. The system that no longer works was designed during the Age of Enlightenment and during the Industrial Revolution. The definition of intelligence was academic mastery and knowledge of the classics, and those who could not conform to this type of intelligence were labeled as non-academic and let themselves be convinced that they were not brilliant. We maintain the habit of labeling people in these two categories and are, therefore, writing off potentially brilliant people for not fitting this antiquated model of intelligence. Gatto reminds us that genius is an exceedingly common human quality, probably natural to most of us. But this system does not support this claim because it professes that there is one definition, not a multiplicity of definitions. Neil Postman, in his book, The End of Education, talks about the difference between a definition and the definition as a very important aspect of improving education. In order to understand definitions, we must consider whose definitions they are and for what purposes they were invented and what alternative definitions might serve equally as well. If we remember that definitions are not part of the natural world, rather they are human inventions, we can allow ourselves to reconsider the meanings that are traditionally assigned to words and transitively systems. The time has come to redefine our views on education. What we are looking at now is a system created in the Industrial Revolution. It was modeled in the interest of and in the image of industrialization. Students are batched by age, despite the fact that this is likely not the most appropriate way to categorize individuals. They are pushed through a system moving in response to the sound of bells, and we take this to be the baseline of the system. But we must ask ourselves if this is truly necessary to accomplish the ends for education that we desire. Another issue Sir Ken brings to light is that we are in one of the most stimulating times ever, receiving information in all sorts of forms, from all sorts of devices, and more so every day. Students find themselves penalized for being distracted by this, when what they're being distracted from is the boring stuff, schoolwork and standardized test prep. It's hard to blame anyone for this distraction. Perhaps the time has come to find ways to make this a part of education in a way much more suited for students. I know that as a part of the independent project, I spent a lot of time on the computer, and some afternoons would be spent watching a collection of videos about education, or listening to NPR accounts of people living with AIDS, or Skyping with a social entrepreneur in California. A modernized system will need to balance students' ability to maintain people skills with taking advantage of the resources available through advancing technologies without viewing these as a threat. It seems more and more likely that students will have almost everything they need to learn at their fingertips, and the adult in the room guiding education will fill the role of a coach rather than the main source of information, which is what we seem to consider a teacher right now. This sounds immensely appealing to me. It provides the opportunity for a more balanced give and take between students and teachers, and between students and their peers, and between teachers and their peers. In an environment where everyone is responsible for the learning, if it is structured appropriately, there is the potential for much greater educational opportunities to be actualized. Responsibility and ownership of the knowledge being gained lets everyone learn not only what can be found in books or online, but also people have a better chance to learn about themselves. Gatto says, self-knowledge is the only basis of true knowledge. If we can understand ourselves and our needs, our education can have direction. The glimpse of this seen in a typical school setting is when students realize which teachers are the best for them and help them be the best learners they can be. And then those students choose to be in the classes with those teachers.